how to systematically review. This whole 8 3-hour sessions is about how to do a systematic review. I'm already moving away from my camera. And it's just because we get people in our offices saying, I want to do a systematic review. And we're like, yeah, that's great. Come back 8 more times. So we can walk you through the process. Because it's really not something you can do in an hour or 2 hours. It's something that does take quite a while. And we've spread it across the summer as much as we can, because that gives us sort of the most opportunity to teach you all the pieces. But even that, you won't get one done this summer probably. I mean, if you really, really want to, you probably can. But it's a lot of work and they often take longer than that. So let's start by introducing ourselves. So I'm Rochelle Witherspoon. This is my colleague Alex Goudreau. We're the health librarians I'm Fredericton and she's St. John. And we've been, we're the ones who get the systematic review requests, I guess. We've done training. We've read lots and lots and lots of method sections. At least that's how I learned.
Yeah, I'm still pretty new at this. I've only been doing this for about a year and a half, and mostly what I've assisted with have been the literature searching sections. So I'm not as up on the methods, but it's all good.
Yeah, let's hope I'm as up on the methods as I think I am. But really, the ideas behind systematic reviews aren't difficult. It's actually doing them that's the challenge. So it relies on you guys to know how to read your literature and how to pull information out of it. We can teach you how to get to it, how to organize it, what pieces you need to be doing, but you need to have the skills to actually use the literature and synthesize it yourselves. So we'll go through everything up to that point and then say, go, and see where things end up. So let's start by getting an idea of who's in the room with us. I have your names, but I don't really know who you are. So why don't you just tell me sort of your name, your degree area, and maybe what you're kind of interested in looking at. We'll start with that. Yeah. And for those of you who aren't familiar, meta-analyses are a subset of systematic reviews that include a statistical component that we won't be covering, so have fun with that. But it's taking all of the stuff we're going to come together and all that information and actually doing statistics with it. So much the same until the very, very end when you have to actually open up SPSS and do something in it. Hands off, sorry.
It's a whole ugly thing, but I got a guy.
Good.
It's always good to have a guy.
I need to know who your guy is.
It's Dr. Boyle.
Okay. So for those of you who don't have specific topics you want to research this summer, spend the next week trying to think of something to at least sort of follow along and use the tools we're going to talk about. Obviously, if you don't have a systematic review in mind, you don't have to finish one. Just having something you can use to practice and play with the stuff that we're going to teach will certainly help you to get these skills down. If you can't come up with something, I will give a question out to the entire class and say, play with this one. I'll make one up at some point. We'll just magically appear. But yeah, so let's talk about systematic reviews. So, systematic reviews are about finding an answer. They are a search for truth. And they're I want my notes.
Yes.
Is this mine?
Yeah, those ones are yours.
Okay. How did you get to print it white?
I don't know.
Mine printed out black. So we're looking at our notes. Mine all came out totally black. Hers has the white writing on it that's so pretty. Clearly I'm an idiot.
Well, I did print them in St. John, so.
Oh, well, so much better.
I guess.
Okay, I'll figure that out.
You don't need to see the slides, you can see the slides on your screen.
Yeah.
You just need your notes.
I need my notes desperately. So they're all about, looking at all the literature available on something, pulling it together and getting one answer out of it. So if you've ever read papers on a topic, you may find papers that conflict with each other, papers that have certain biases, papers that say something sort of similar-ish but not quite. And systematic reviews are asking a question and pulling that all into one answer. You'll see them a lot guiding evidence-based practice, and they're kind of like the gold standard for evidence-based practice is systematic reviews. And if you're familiar with clinical guidelines at all, clinical guidelines are composed of multiple systematic reviews. They just cover an entire topic. So I did an umbrella review, which we'll talk about. That is a review of systematic reviews, and I did it on clinical guidelines. And I was doing clinical guidelines on pre-operative hip fractures. And each guideline had probably 15 or 20 systematic reviews on different pieces of that preoperative period. So So yeah, it's about best practice, it's about answers, it's about getting all the best stuff in one place and making sure people know that it's the best stuff, which is always nice to see your name in like nice glowing golden letters. So as much as I would love to say, systematic reviews are this beautiful glowing thing, they really are, but they're the answer to a problem. And the problem is that research isn't perfect. There are lots of things that systematic reviews have to overcome and are used to overcome in the literature, including publication bias, false positives, different qualities of research, which are definitely a thing. And they also incorporate sort of white papers and non-peer-reviewed information that may not appear so much in databases that we typically search. And I'll talk about each of those pieces and their significance to the literature right now. So, publication bias. Is anyone here familiar with the idea of publication bias? Okay.
We've got a hand over there.
Yeah, we talked about it Monday, a couple days ago. So Tracy Rickards and anyone who's ever published a paper will know that journals don't want to publish negative results. So you do a study and you don't find anything, no journal's going to take that in. They don't like them, and that creates publication bias. So publication bias is this idea that only some things get published, even though lots of research is being done. So if you ever do a literature search for proof of ESP, journals love to prove ESP is real. They love it. Because every once in a while, you guys familiar with like the idea of a p-value? Like p equals 0.05? So p equals 0.05 implies that 1 out of every 20 studies is wrong. Like that's basically the idea behind it. So 1 out of every 20 studies will prove that ESP is real, and journals like, yeah, we've got this, even though we know it's not. Or sorry, if you look at the entire case of literature, not so much. So publication bias is that tendency of journals to only publish certain things. So that includes negative results. Journals really like sensational stuff, and it's systemic. This bias towards certain kinds of publication. So by looking at everything, we start to weed out that idea of publication bias. False positives. So false positives are sort of the it's supposed to be their side of publication bias. Because again, if your p is 0.05, 1 in 20 chance, you're still going to get it wrong. And that's a false positive. It's saying you think something is true when it's not. And those happen, like even in the best research, those are a thing. So again, systematic reviews are just there to help that not happen, or help that not impact behavior. There's some really scary articles and videos on cancer research seminal studies. So if you go back far enough, you find like 20 seminal cancer studies that have been replicated and built upon for years and years and years. And you'll find out that when they actually go to replicate those original studies, they have like a 30% success rate. That's because false positives. Like it just causes problems. So again, systematic reviews help to minimize the impact of those things. Yeah. Quality. Different qualities of studies, different qualities of journals, different qualities, types of research, and not even, like, and even just sort of different types of research, different levels of research. Some fields don't allow for certain kinds of research, so you can't do a randomized control trial on smoking because you can't assign someone to smoke. It's kind of a problem. So there's sort of different levels of research, and systematic reviews work with that as well. They look at, this type of research has more evidence value to it than this type of research, so we're going to give it more strength in our synthesis. Non-traditional sources. So non-traditional sources we will talk about more in session 5 or 6 or something like that.
Somewhere down the line.
But they're what we call gray literature. And gray literature is any piece of research or piece of information that is published by a non-publisher. This includes government organizations, the government itself, so like the World Health Organization, Government of Canada. It includes conference proceedings that don't get published in a journal. It includes some types of clinical trials. And systematic reviews try to bring that stuff in because it's not as vulnerable to the issues of publication bias and false positives. It tends to balance out that stuff fairly effectively. It also brings in pieces of information that may not make it into peer-reviewed literature just because of their topic base. So Indigenous content is very, very prevalent in grey literature, where it has not been so prevalent in the peer-reviewed literature until recently. You'll find sort of global health issues tend to appear in grey literature as opposed to peer-reviewed literature because it's beyond the scope of a single researcher who just can't handle that in a journal article. So you'll find information in those grey literature sources that you don't find in peer-reviewed content. So we do try to include those in systematic reviews as well, at least as sort of a best practice. Not all systematic reviews include grey literature, but many of them do.
Is that door just automatically?
Must. Okay. So, systematic reviews deal with the issue of publication bias, false positives, different qualities of research, and white papers and sort of like non-peer-reviewed stuff. And they do that by catching everything. Yeah. So systematic reviews are the idea that we're just going to get everything. We're going to pull every single piece of information in the world on this topic. Sometimes that's thousands of articles. Sometimes that's 5 articles. I found one case where it was 0 articles, which I thought was hilarious. And just really, really weird and a lot of effort to get nothing. But it really is the effort to find everything. So I can tell you from experience that as of a year and a half ago, there were only 5 articles in the English language that dealt with the topic of intramuscular injections in obese people and how needle length is impacted, or how needle length affects their effectiveness. There's only 5 articles, and they're not very good. They're really not. So sometimes the topics are small. If you're dealing with most topics related to obesity, you'll find tons of information. Some topics are more popular than others. Yes?
So the more precise your question or the more you hone in on a specific topic could potentially lead to less articles and then being able to condense all that information in a more like efficient, like for one person kind of thing. Like I've read certain reviews where it's like 5 or 6 researchers because there's so much information that they divvy it up and they have a criteria that they go through. But if the closer you put the magnifying glass to the topic, the less like it's going to be, I guess.
Okay. So for the microphone, the question is sort of the more specific your topic becomes, the less stuff there will be, and the more the more manageable it is as a question. There's a yes and no to this question. Systematic reviews are by their nature very specific. They tend to narrow in on a very specific topic, with the exception being scoping reviews, which tend to have a broader base. On the other hand, and you're not gonna like me for saying this, systematic reviews are team-based. They are very rarely done by one single person because best practice involves having someone else check your screening process, check your search, check your synthesis. Like all those things are done as a partnership or as a team of 3 people at least. And that's just, again, it's just so you can say to the world, I did this exactly right. Did that capture most of it, or do you?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, and this will come into play when we get into the literature searching side of things. Even if you do have the most specific, narrow topic that there may only be 2 or 3 really excellent articles out there, the type of searching that you're going to have to do is still going to pull back hundreds, maybe thousands of articles that you'll have to sift through for those 3 good ones.
Yeah.
So narrow is great, and that's what we're going to be dealing with next week when we get into developing your question. But yeah, it depends.
Yeah, and on that, I'll actually offer an example that I'm struggling with this week. So, Emily, I'm working with her and a team to do a systematic review on face-to-face versus digitally mediated or technologically mediated weight loss programs. And I had this search and it produced like 6,000 results. I'm like, okay, that's ridiculous for one database. Let's see if we can get it down. And I got it down to about 2,000 results in Medline, which I thought was pretty good. And then I translated that search over to CINAHL and got 163,000 items. So I will figure that out at some point, probably this week, I hope. But dealing with thousands of articles is nothing even remotely unusual in systematic reviews. You don't have to read all those thousands of articles because that would be insane. But you'd have to read all their titles and maybe some of their abstracts and some of the full content. And we'll talk about that as we go through the screening process and how that happens. So yeah, we do our best to get a search that brings it down to a reasonable size. Some topics lend themselves to that more effectively than others. Gotta say that intramuscular injection in obese people narrowed down really nicely. Weight loss programs, not so much. But we'll see where this goes in the next week or so. At least I will.
That certainly speaks to the importance of writing a really good title on your article, because if you want it to be captured in the right way,
Yep.
then you've got to be really specific and not cutesy.
Yeah. Longer titles, just in terms of getting cited on stuff, longer titles tend to be cited more. These people see the title, see that it was relevant, and they use it. If they see a 3-word title, they're not going to look into the abstract. They're not going to bother. Just a weird, quirky little side pitch on titles, because I care about title length. Because it really impacts my ability to do my job effectively. Okay, so systematic reviews catch everything, and they do that by going through a long series of stages. And by doing a very, very advanced search. So we're librarians, we search is what we do. We're going to spend 2 classes on it because it's hard and it's a lot of content. And we're going to talk about using synonyms and subject terms and advanced searching tools like Boolean operators and truncation and proximity searches. We'll talk about high fidelity filters. So there's filters that are already designed to pull out certain kinds of literature. For instance, Cochrane developed a filter that they use to just pull out randomized control trials. That's very, very good. You search in multiple databases. You search for gray literature and gray literature tools. You look at the references of your papers that you like, and you read the references, and you pull stuff out of there. So there's a whole lot of pieces that go into pulling up all of this information. And we'll talk about how to do those pieces as we go through this course. And the really big thing, and the reason it's called a systematic review, is that all of these things are done in a systematic and replicable way. So, systematic and replicable means you are not just searching willy-nilly. Most of the time when people search, they do a search, and it doesn't work, and they do another search, and it doesn't work, and they do another search. And I call this serial searching, because that works. For the most time, if you're writing a 4-page paper for a class, serial searching is fine, mostly. Some of my nursing students would disagree. But systematic reviews are about doing one really, really good search, the same every time you use a database. So it is pre-planned. It is occasionally peer-reviewed before you actually use it. It is tested across multiple databases, as seen by my failure with CINAHL this week. It is recorded. It is often laid out in a certain format. And we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, at some point about Google and Google Scholar, my frenemies. And they cause a problem because they're not systematic. They're not replicable. My Google Scholar is different from your Google Scholar. My Google Scholar is different from someone in China. So it's used sometimes. We'll talk about those if you really want to. I don't like them, don't use them. Some arguments for Google, if I have to. But the idea is that it's like 99% of the time, what you're doing in your systematic review should be able to be replicated by another researcher just by looking at it. So if you do a search and you hand it to me, I should get the same results as you do. And that's systematic reviews. That's what they're called. It's what they're based on. It's what the whole idea is behind them. The only exception to the systematic part of systematic reviews is gray literature searching. And we'll talk about gray literature later, but most gray literature sources, so like the World Health Organization, are not set up for the type of searching done in systematic reviews. They just don't have the capacity, so you end up doing serial searches in those where you wouldn't otherwise. So, recap. Systematic reviews are designed to grab everything, consider all the evidence in all of its forms, and it's performed in a verifiable, systematic, and replicable way. So, steps to writing a systematic review. We're going to probably touch these over and over and over again because they're so integral into how they're performed. But I'll go through them really quickly right now. I won't spend a whole lot of time on any one of them because we will spend a class on most of them. But I'll tell you sort of what you're getting into now, so that if you need to run scared, you can do it after the first class. So systematic reviews include an introduction, which is kind of weird, because introductions are a summary of literature, which is what a systematic review is. But they do include an introduction. It's usually just like it's not super extensive because your whole systematic review is on that topic, but it gives some background, some context for why you're doing what you're doing and why it matters. Method sections. Method sections make up like 90% of a systematic review, because systematic reviews are all about how you got to the information so you can prove that it's good stuff. So in your method section, you have a search design, which will be the next 2 classes. We'll talk about how to build your search, what tools you need to use to build your search, how to find synonyms, what other stuff's out there, and sort of what's available in general for you to use. Searches have to be inclusive when you're doing a search. So it's possible to narrow something down to like 5 or 6 articles on a topic, but you have to make sure you catch everything, so you have to keep it fairly broad when you're doing a search. Gray literature, we have spoken about, and it's done under that sort of search design section of your paper, but it is a different type of search in a different category. Inclusion. So inclusion criteria, when you've done your search and you have your, say, 4,000 results, which I think is probably fairly reasonable. Yeah. You go through titles and abstracts, and you start deciding which ones you want to keep and which ones you want to get rid of. The trick here is you have to apply the same criteria to every article all through those 4,000 articles. So your rules have to be the same at the beginning as they are at the end, which can be difficult after you've read 4,000 titles. So your inclusion criteria are the rules that you are bound by that you cannot break. And they include things like this population must be above 60 years old, or must include technology, or must include people with BMIs over 25. So it's those kinds of pieces that you're bound by. It can also be things like language. Article has to be written in English. I pretty much speak English. I speak a bit of French, but I wouldn't want to read a peer-reviewed article in it. It includes things like the age of the article. So if an article is more than 15 years old, you're not interested. If you're going to use an age criteria, talk to us first, because they're a shifty group of sort of do this when. For instance, again, the one I'm working on with Emily and her team, we're using age criteria that blocks it at, is it 1990? 1990, because before that, internet wasn't really a thing. So it doesn't matter what was published before, because we don't care. And types of articles. So some systematic reviews limit to just randomized control trials. Some systematic reviews, like umbrella reviews, are only systematic reviews, which is crazy. Some of them like to use only qualitative research, and those are called qualitative systematic reviews. So there's a whole bunch of different types of limiters you're going to need to apply. Typically, I would say the average systematic review has like 4 inclusion criteria. They're also called exclusion criteria. Some people will say, yeah, well, you need inclusion and exclusion. You only need one. So pick whether you like inclusion or exclusion better. It doesn't matter. The principles are the same.
I
Yes.
have a question about language.
Yes.
When I was putting together my proposal, I said I'm only going to take them in English, and one of the reviewers suggested that if you find something in another language, you just throw it through Google Translate. What are your thoughts on that? No?
I've never seen that done,
Okay.
and I don't know that I'd advise it. I mean, as awesome as Google Translate is, it's really not that awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever seen someone?
I have also had people suggest that, but at the same time, one of the workshops that I've attended did talk about not limiting searches by language, regardless of what your ultimate inclusion criteria was going to be, just in case you do happen to stumble upon like really good literature that's in Portuguese. And maybe if it looks really good, because chances are the title and abstract are going to be in English, and you're not going to realize it's not in English unless you've already put a language limit on, or then you realize afterwards, once you've included it, that, oh, crap, I can't read the full text. But if it looks good enough to consider, you could always reach out to the author, try and find somebody else who might be able to read it, or it can be, I think, mentioned in the systematic review just
Okay.
as a note. But that's...
So if I was to find 5 languages in Mandarin, I said, these studies were put through Google Translate.
Because of your systematic review.
That'd be a weakness.
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Other ways of doing it.
systematic reviews rely on specificity and a specificness of topic that Google Translate doesn't have the nuance for. I would argue. Although in your case, I can understand why language would be a thing, 'cause his research includes bilingual components. Yeah, my suggestion is to stick with English unless you happen to speak Mandarin,
I don't.
or learn Mandarin. I mean, you have a year. You could figure that out, right?
I on my phone.
Oh, yeah. Or you could, if you had the foresight and applied for a research grant or had some money, you could pay somebody to translate it. You know?
Problem solved.
Problem solved.
Yeah.
But yeah, Google Translate, I would say, is imprecise.
Maybe in 50 years we could pull it off. Maybe. Because language is getting simpler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about the years. So you said something about 1990. We shouldn't include anything before that? Or?
In the context of that specific study,
Oh,
we
okay.
did include things before 1990 because the study relied on the internet and telecommunications
Oh, okay.
in a way that just made 1990 sort of a good cutoff.
Uh-huh.
And it was a cutoff not to avoid previous literature, it was a cutoff because none of that stuff was going to be useful to us. Different cases, different rules. I would say, sorry,
I
yes?
was gonna add on to that question of how would you determine that
Yeah.
magical year?
Yeah, how do you choose your year? I would say in 90% of cases I wouldn't apply a year at all. And really, it only comes up if you think it's going to make a really big difference. So,
If you know your topic too, and you know when the sort of foundational research has been done, then you can sort of go, okay, well,
Yeah.
I won't go before that because that foundational research is what everything else come after it has been based on.
yeah, so a part of it certainly is knowing your topic. Part of it is knowing something about history. So when I'm talking to kinesiology students, I often talk about running shoes, and the literature on running shoes. 30 years ago, the literature on running shoes was done by Nike, and they had a certain vested interest in the outcome of that study. Whereas more recently, it's being done by actual researchers who don't care what Nike thinks. Indigenous literature, I'm going to come back to this one again because it something comes up in my practice all the time as indigenous literature. Has significantly changed over the years, and has become sort of less I'm judging you and more we're working together. And that makes a difference in a systematic review and what it's going to find. Is, they're horrible, I don't like them, I'm going to write bad stuff about them, versus let's work together and just acknowledge our cultures are different, and those differences are just what they are. So those kinds of topics tend to lend themselves towards a date limiter, where those things start to split, if that makes sense. But I would say in most cases you don't use them. I feel like every time I bring up indigenous topics I get a little bit in trouble, but I mean it is what it is, right? That literature has changed a lot. Okay, other questions at this point? No, okay. So screening process. The screening process comes directly from your inclusion criteria. So and we'll talk about this later, but when you develop your inclusion criteria, what I recommend is reading like 50 titles, figuring out what you like and what you don't like, and writing them down then. So looking at a bit, making your rules, and then moving forward. Screening process is when you actually apply those rules to the rest of the stuff. This is often done in a set of 2 or 3 people, where each of you goes through, decides which ones you keep and get rid of, and when you disagree, you go together and say, I disagree with you on this is why. And you either work it out together as a team, or you have a third person come in and mediate that decision. So that's basically what happens there. And at this point, it's really good to mention you should record that information. You should record those disagreements and how you came up with resolutions to them. You should record what decisions were made at that time. And in general, during a systematic review, you should record everything. I mean, like everything from the get-go. including like how many search results each database produced, how many duplicates there were between the databases, how many articles were screened, how many you kept when they were screened, how many you kept between, your screening of abstracts and titles versus screening of the actual full article, how you went about doing that, who you were working with, whether you had, 2 teams doing screening or just one. All of those things you need to keep track of, because at some point someone's going to ask you about them. So it's going to come back if you don't have a record. Yes.
So what if you are doing using your search criteria in X amount, 15 databases, and then that's a lot. Let's say 3
Probably
databases.
more than you need.
And then you get 4,000 or 5,000 articles, and then so you have like your question that you search in each of the databases, and then you go back a month later, and there's now 5,200. So at what point do you stop and be like, okay, at this date we stop searching, and then moving forward to the screening process?
So there's a couple answers to that question, things you could do. I would say first is it's perfectly okay to say, I did my search on this date, and that's where it stopped, as long as your systematic review comes out within a reasonable period of time from that. If your systematic review takes a very long time to publish, you can always go back and just reperform those searches, shove it into Zotero, get rid of duplicates, and find out how much new stuff there is and update your systematic review. And lastly, you can use search alerts. So most databases have a tool you can go in and say, update me on the search in a month. And it'll just say, these are the new stuff that came out of that search for you. It'll sort of keep you up to date as you go through the process, which is a nice feature. Any database you can think of that doesn't have that feature? I mean, your gray literature sources won't.
No.
But most of the peer-reviewed literature does have that tool.
And would you recommend Zotero for doing literature?
We will be teaching Zotero.
Okay.
You can certainly use any citation management database you want. Do use a citation management database. It will save you. I like Zotero. It's what I know. It's what I teach. It's open source. I could give a lot of arguments for Zotero, but mostly it's open source and not owned by an evil corporation. Yes?
You mentioned that a common number might be like 4,000 articles that you fill out. How long does this process take going through this whole step by step?
A year?
Soup to
Average?
nuts, yeah, it can take a year.
I've certainly seen them happen faster, but I would say a year is about normal.
Yeah. It depends
So
on
dissertation?
Yeah. Depends on how many people you have on the team. Depends on how much time you have to devote to this. So if this is the only thing you're working on and the only thing the other people on your team are working on, it could probably move along a little bit quicker. But I know in our situation at least, trying to do literature searches for people at the same time of doing other things that are part of your job, the literature search piece takes a long time just to do it well. And then the other big piece is screening your articles. Like those are your 2 most time-consuming pieces, I think. Writing might take a while, but it's really getting the articles you need, going through them, and like when I'm gonna do my bit, we'll talk briefly about something called rapid reviews, which can be done quicker, but should still be as systematic as possible. So yeah.
What's your best record?
We do not control the timeline. We have nothing to do with that.
Yeah, our involvement, my involvement to this point, I've only been in the academic setting for a year and a half. Before that, I was in the hospital, and I didn't assist with this kind of research. When I started at UMB, November 2017, I immediately got involved in a scoping review that had just started. And so that's a year and a half ago. The protocol has been published. We are through the screening process, currently looking at the references of the full text articles that are being included. Gray literature's been done. I think they're hoping to be done maybe by the end of the summer, and that's a bunch of people who are faculty and have other things on the go.
I was involved again in an umbrella review. It's the only systematic review I've been part of that's actually been finished. to my knowledge. I'm sure they happen to get finished beyond my scope. But it took probably a year. And I mean, the search took a while, and then clinical guidelines are hefty documents, ranging from 50 to 600 pages. Big range. 50 not good, 600 really good. Really boring. And yeah, it took about a year. And that was only 5 clinical guidelines. Admittedly, clinical guidelines this long. Yeah, hard to say. It depends on your motivation and how busy you are, and how busy your team is. So if you're partnering with a faculty member, don't hold your breath. No offense. We just know you're busy.
And it also might depend on the question that you decide to try and work on, and then you go to the literature, and depending on what's out there, it might be too broad, and you might realize that you have to reframe your question a little bit to try and narrow in on something that hasn't been as covered. So sometimes it's a lot of back and forth as well, which is, I think I've got 5 active reviews that I'm working on in various stages with different people. And in a couple of them, I've been trying to work on the literature search piece of it, and I've had to go back and tell them, I think your question is too broad, because otherwise you're going to be sifting through like 10,000 articles, and I don't think that's reasonable. So,
Yep.
So are we able to reach out to you folks to be part of the team in terms of, because you keep talking about like articles and stuff that you're working on?
Yeah.
In terms of that person to help with the screening process and the sifting through like the sum of articles.
When the systematic review is being performed by a faculty member, we will partner with that team at their request to do the search design and some of the deduping stuff in return for partial authorship on those papers. We do not do searching for graduate students because it is part of their degree programs. I have on one occasion done the search protocol for an undergraduate student who was just in over her head. But yeah, that's pretty much our policy. And we will turn down requests to become partners when we get too many of them, because we're human.
yes. But for grad students, we are happy to meet with you and
Yes,
we will
through
help what a search strategy could look like, recommend databases, and just basically do everything except the actual hard work of it. And the scoping review that I was talking about, because it was the first one that I got involved in, they basically said I could have as much or as little involvement as I wanted. And so I've kind of dipped my hand in here and there as I've had time, just so that I can start getting more familiar with the whole process. Because yes, I've done the training through the Joanna Briggs Institute for systematic reviews, but unless you actually do one yourself and you're just doing your own little piece, it's sometimes hard to really get a sense of what the other pieces are. So
Yeah.
that's...
And I mean, we'll help to sort of varying degrees depending on the type of question you're being asked. So in Jordan's case, we met on Monday to talk about his systematic review. And he told me his topic, and I kind of went, what? I don't even know where to start with that. So we sat down for an hour with me asking, what kind of results might you get out of those studies? What words might be used? And we sat down for an hour, and I kept typing into databases, seeing what was happening, not really getting anywhere. And at the point where I've spent an hour looking at something and not even come up with an idea of where to go, I said, why don't we meet again? I'll take a look and figure out what pieces come together well, and we'll meet and we'll try it again later. So in that case, I went through, found some terms, found some ways to bring them together in a way that made sense, and said, here's a basic sort of outline for how you should search. Now go add your own words. Like, go look for synonyms, go build it up a little bit more, try some things. I would say at some point searches get too difficult for graduate students who don't have library degrees. But for the most part, we do expect you to do that yourself. We'll just show you the way. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Good to move forward? All right. So screening. Appraisal. This is the point where you guys are more or less on your own. We'll show you the tools to do it, but we can't do it for you. And we can't even really say, this is how you do it, because we do not appraise articles. We can.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on the subject area, I could do it. A critical appraisal is the point where you evaluate the quality of an article. You look for sort of its overall quality. You give it a ranking based on the tool you're using. You look at whether there's bias, whether the person who wrote it has a vested interest in its outcome. And they're basically done on any article you intend to include in your study. And it's done to give weight to your study, to your systematic review. And it's done in a way that the different approaches to how you use appraisal, there are different approaches to how you use appraisal in systematic reviews. You can say, I praised them and kept all the ones above this score, or I praised them and gave more weight to the ones above this score. So there's different ways to use them, but they're just a way to say there is a consideration of quality and strength in the study. Yes?
You don't do that in scoping reviews, do you? Or do you?
No.
Okay.
And you don't do them in all systematic reviews. I've certainly seen systematic reviews that did not include critical appraisals. I would say that they are best practice, but not required in most journals. Some journals. Not required by all journals anyway.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about different types of systematic reviews, because we just keep saying systematic reviews, but, you know, as Amy mentioned, scoping reviews, and I've talked about scoping reviews, they're a little bit different, but they are still in that family. And so when you guys go off and try and decide what type of review you do want to do, you'll be able to figure out how much appraisal is required.
Yeah. And we'll talk a bit about different journals and different requirements and different standards. Because again, I'll say, most journals do this, or most systematic reviews have this, and this is best practice. But journals do differ in terms of their requirements for systematic reviews. And we'll tell you how to find out what those are, and how to consider them when you're actually doing your own review. Extraction and synthesis. Again, this is somewhere we can tell you sort of how to go about it, but not actually help you with it all that much. So extraction is that point where you have your articles, you've read them, you've appraised them for quality, you know you want to include them. It's the actual part where you pull the important information out and actually include it. So this is often done in table format. You'll have a table that asks for like the population, the tool being used, the outcome, the type of the study. So it's like a table-based summary of each article that makes it easy for you to say, this is what generally happened across the board. This is what I'm going to talk about. This is its critical appraisal rating. It's just pulling the data out and making it accessible to you to use as a researcher. These tables can be included in systematic reviews as their published document. So again, do check your spelling, do be mindful of what you put in it, and do keep it when you're done, and do actually write one because you need to have it. At some point, someone will ask. But it is just that point where you're pulling it all out and making it so you can look at it. And synthesis is when you have it all in front of you, you decide what it all means, and write a paper. So that's you're pulling your conclusions. You're deciding that 60 studies said this, and this one study said this. So I'm going to say this is what the truth of this topic is from that extracted data. We will have a class on extraction and synthesis at the very, very end. I'll probably do the talk on extraction, I think, according to our documents. Because I'm actually involved in one right now. I'm going to look for a guest lecturer to talk about synthesis, because it is not my area of expertise. I did not love thesis writing. Yeah, there's a reason I'm a librarian. Okay, appendices. Appendices are my favorite part of systematic reviews, like no joke. I get so excited when I find one. I'm like, yeah, I get this thing. And the reason is that's where all the information that I care about is. It's where the words they used were, it's what databases they used, it's the Prisma diagram that says how much duplication there was between databases. This is I get really excited about this stuff. Because I'm lazy and I want to see what other people searched, so I can just use their words.
It's not lazy, it's practical.
It's effective. I'm being time efficient.
Yes.
Yeah, but I get really excited when systematic reviews have this stuff. So yeah, your appendices will include your extraction table. They will include a copy of your search from at least one database. So like if you did a search in Medline, you might print out that search history. Some systematic reviews include all of them. So like every search you did across databases, I think that's a little bit of overkill. Some will include one, some will not include it at all. I do like it when it has at least one, because you can say, look what I did it right the first time. It's also a really good way to judge quality of systematic reviews. Is if you can see their search and see what they did and know that what they did was good, you can judge your systematic reviews outcomes on that search, at least to some degree. Prisma diagrams we will definitely talk about, and they are the place where you show everyone else how many things you found. So it starts off with, I've found this many articles across all of these databases, duplication included. So if I found like 4,000 in Medline and 4,000 in CINAHL, probably only have like 6,000 articles in total, but it'll say I have 8,000 in that box because I found 4,000 and 4,000 and just add them together. Next box down will say I got rid of all the duplicates. I now have only 6,000. And then it'll go down and it'll say I went through the titles and abstracts. I now have only like 1,000 that I want to keep. That's a lot. I now have only like 60 that I want to keep.
1,000 you want to consider, maybe, but even still.
And then you go through, like, okay, I'm going to read these 60 full text. Now I only want to keep 30 because those 60 weren't actually as relevant as I thought they were. So I have 30. And then you do your critical appraisal and say, actually, I only want to keep the ones that scored this well on critical appraisal, so now I have 20. And that's what you end up including in your final document, is those 20 articles you found. Prisma diagram is just you're saying, this is where I started, and this is where I ended up, and this is how I got there. Yeah, and again, all that stuff goes into the appendix, which is a great and wonderful thing. Please make one, I love them. They make me very happy. So, recap. I don't even have a list of things to recap.
We'll cover these later.
Yeah, well, we'll get back to it. Just go backwards with the slides, I swear. Yeah, so that's the methodology behind a systematic review in a nutshell. Again, we'll spend a class on most of these topics so you have a better idea of really how they go about happening. But wanted to give you an idea of what you were getting to now. Any questions about what we've covered so far? Have I scared anyone away yet? No, not yet? Okay, good. Almost. We will walk you through the whole thing. Okay, so I will pass it over to Alex.
Sure.
And get out of the camera. Oh.
Well, if you sit there, you're going to be on camera. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the different kinds of systematic reviews, because we keep talking about systematic reviews as one big thing, and it's not. Really, we should be calling it evidence synthesis or knowledge synthesis, but we're just using systematic reviews for shorthand. And traditionally, systematic reviews have been more focused on randomized control trials of therapeutic interventions. But there has been a shift as more and more people are doing systematic reviews to different types of questions and thus different types of evidence, particularly qualitative, which didn't used to be as big of a thing. So, like I say, we say systematic review a lot, but do we actually mean that in the sense of how Rochelle described it? It may or may not actually be a systematic review. And when you've done some of the searching in the literature, you may have seen things called a systematic scoping review, or a systematic review and meta-analysis, or a scoping review, or an umbrella review. Like, we've already thrown out some of these terminologies. And the language around systematic reviews and evidence synthesis has changed and is changing. And there tends not to be a lot of common terminology because different organizations are doing these things. And so people kind of can call them whatever they want, which makes it fun for searching sometimes. And it can be confusing. So we're at least going to try and provide you with some tools to guide you in maybe what kinds of reviews that you want to consider doing. And so the issue is mostly around the type of question that you're going to ask and the types of evidence that you're going to use to answer this question. So that's, I hope, what's going to guide you in trying to figure out what kind of review that you're doing. So if you want a kind of science analogy to make this make a little bit more sense, if you look at systematic reviews as the overall family, and then the different types of reviews that you could do as different species within that family, that might be another way to look at this. So we're not going to go too in depth in any of these particular ones, because again, we're going to let you guys go off and try and figure out which one you might like to do, and we can provide some guidance on that. But this is an idea of how many different kinds there are out there. And I've got 2 really good articles that I'm going to share on D2L that do talk about the different types and how to choose what review you want to do. So I would recommend looking at those. And yeah, I think one of your homework is also going to be looking at JBI's list of reviews. So the Joanna Briggs Institute has identified...
Oh, Cochrane. You know JBI.
What?
What? I don't even remember what the homework was.
Oh.
That was terrible.
Got notes that say we're going to get you guys to look at the 10 different JBI.
Oh, right, we're going to look at
Types.
the handbook that's
Yes.
available online. That was it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
the
yeah.
Joanna Briggs Institute, which is one of the organizations that does systematic reviews, has identified 10 specific types. So it's, again, another tool that you could use. And I'm going to talk more specifically about a few. Rochelle has mentioned meta-analysis already, and you've probably heard meta-analysis most often referred to as systematic review and meta-analysis as one big thing, but you can actually do it separately, or you could do it together as part of your systematic review. And so we've got a couple of specifics where a quantitative meta-analysis is where you do the statistical results of 2 or more primary studies combined into one data set and then reanalyzed. You can do qualitative meta-analysis where you summarize with words what your statistical results are of your quantitative primary studies, or narratively describe that data from your analyzed qualitative studies. But if you do want to do a meta-analysis, it would be advisable to get a statistician on your team or somebody really good with numbers. Get a guy, because unless you are really good at this side of things, this is where having a team does really help. So scoping reviews, we've touched on a little bit here and there. Scoping reviews are also kind of interesting because they can be part of a systematic review, but they can also just be their own thing. And you might think, oh, well, scoping review should be shorter than a systematic review, but it's not. Because you're still trying to do the same systematic, reproducible, transparent collection of evidence, but your question is a bit more broad. Scoping reviews, you're scoping the literature. You're trying to find out what's out there on a particular topic to see if maybe there's some gaps in the research that you can then go on and do your own research, or see if there's enough articles out there to actually do a systematic review. So sometimes a scoping review can be the first step in your systematic review before you even get started. Because, as Rochelle mentioned, there is at least one systematic review out there that got published that has no articles. And so
Courtesy of
really,
JBI.
yes, we learned that at our JBI training. Ideally, they probably should have done a scoping review, realized there was nothing out there, and then not bothered doing the systematic review. So scoping reviews, as I mentioned, are basically my only experience so far in this fun world of evidence synthesis, and I can definitely tell you they aren't any shorter than doing a normal systematic review, because the searches are almost worse for scoping reviews because the question is more broad, and you are trying to pull in as much as possible on this particular topic.
What's
Yes.
JBI?
JBI is the Joanna Briggs Institute, and I'm actually going to talk about that in a couple minutes, so you will be hopefully a little bit more informed. Yes?
Every time you say that acronym, I think you're saying JDI, like Irving.
And it's really like,
Wait,
we're
is
talking
it-
about
Is it
Irving.
JBI or J?
B.
JBI, yes, Joanna Briggs Institute. The Irvings have nothing to do with this, which is good. Yeah, so I really like
scoping reviews because they do give you that sense of where are there gaps in the literature. Personally, with a couple of other librarians, I've started to do our own scoping review, and it's, I think, going to then lead us to do a bit of actual research into the topic that we're looking at. So I will get to do all of this fun stuff that you guys are going to be doing too. Oh, no. Moved along on my notes, didn't move along on my slides. So we're still talking about specific types of reviews. I mentioned rapid reviews earlier, where you can apply the general methods of a systematic review, but in a shorter time frame, so more like 5 weeks rather than 6 to 12 months. You might be thinking, maybe I'll do a rapid review instead. But because it's shorter, you are employing some shortcuts, which could introduce bias, as Rochelle talked about, and your search isn't really run in as many places because, you're trying to do it a bit quicker. The usefulness of a rapid review does tend to come when you're addressing issues that need a quick decision, like policy recommendations. So this might be something that's a bit more done in healthcare, like in the healthcare setting, not necessarily in research about healthcare. And then umbrella reviews, which Rochelle also mentioned, which are reviews of other systematic reviews, which is sort of like the cartoon I had up with the meta-analysis of meta-analysis and just seeing how meta you can get. And these do tend to be most useful when you've got competing interventions to consider, or as Rochelle had done about guidelines.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to speak any more about doing umbrella reviews and the fun you had with it.
Oh, yeah.
And whether you'd recommend people to do this?
I will never ever volunteer for this ever again. I didn't know what I was getting into at the time. It was educational and something that I was certainly able to do. So umbrella reviews are reviews of systematic reviews, or reviews of clinical guidelines, which are compilations of systematic reviews. And they function a little differently. They don't tend to have as many things to review because who writes 2 systematic reviews on the same topic? It happens, not much. And they function differently because the way you critically appraise a systematic review is different. It's based on all those things like how it was searched and who the bias and what databases did they use and what search terms did they use and did they critically appraise. So it's a judgment of how well they did their systematic review more than it is a judgment of what they were systematic reviewing. And you come to the end and say, these systematic reviews were awesome. You should take their advice as opposed to this one, which was not. In terms of what I did for the umbrella review, we had 5 clinical guidelines we were working on. 3 were really, really big and 2 were really, really small. One of the small ones we decided was just not good enough to be included. And the other one we found was actually just a summary of one of the bigger ones we had. So we said, we're including this information, but it's already here from this article or from this clinical guideline that's 600 pages long. In terms of systematic reviews and what they are, there are worse ones to do, just because, again, there was only 5 clinical guidelines to work with. The fact that those guidelines were 600 pages long was unfortunate. But they do require you to really, really understand the process behind a systematic review, which you will by the end, but just maybe don't do one this time, maybe next time.
Yeah, and I would say that as the literature on systematic reviews and people doing them has really exploded over the last, 10 to 15 years, it seems to be. Yeah.
I think it's doubled in the last 6.
Yeah, systematic reviews are everywhere. And so doing an umbrella review can be a really, really useful thing because the quality of people doing systematic reviews hopefully is getting better. I know when I've had to look for search strategies and appendices of systematic reviews, like Rochelle mentioned, some of the older ones, they just haven't documented that. Some of the newer ones document it really well. So I think everybody is learning from the experience of doing systematic reviews, and by doing an umbrella review, you can really assess the quality of those older systematic reviews on a topic and whether or not, the research was just bad. So they can be really useful, I think, especially as more and more people are doing systematic reviews.
Well, and part of the beauty of an umbrella review, as much as I did not love doing it, is that if, you look at 5 systematic reviews and they all say the same thing, the probability that what they're saying is true is really, really high. Because the critical, systematic reviews are already the gold standard, and you're taking this gold standard and actually analyzing it again and saying, this is really, really, really true. So as a resource of information and as a source for decisions, umbrella reviews are like not just gold, they're diamonds, they're platinum, they're an amazing thing. Yeah.
So I know a couple people mentioned that they're either working on or hope to work on reviews. Has anybody had experiences with some of the ones we've talked about or any of the ones that we didn't mention? If they want to share how awesome or horrible it was? Sure.
Yeah, I did kind of a mini original search in preparation for this. And yeah, just going through and screening it, there's a little piece of me that died. And it's going to die again, or another piece is going to die. It's a long process.
A bigger piece.
You do get a larger
More
chunk
results.
off the same piece. But you do get such a broad understanding of the topic, even just by screening through it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Just you absorb that and most of it. It's kills a little piece of you.
Yeah.
Do you guys find that it kills a little piece of you? Just you enjoy it?
I
Um,
don't have
Mine
to do
now.
screening.
Yeah,
that.
I haven't really had experience doing screening, though one of the groups that I was working on, they had a bunch of people doing the screening of the articles, and one person kind of treated it like a game.
Oh, yeah.
Like, she was just at home treating it like she was playing Candy Crush or something, and just, going through each and felt really satisfied clicking the yes, no button and just, zipped through it. But
Should totally design like a Tinder for systematic reviews. Swipe left or swipe right. Be so much fun.
yeah.
For a geek like me.
Yeah, and I mean, the stuff that we do with the literature searching can be tedious, for sure, especially once you've done it for one database and then you realize, as we will get into when we get into the searching stuff, you can't just take what you've done in one database and search it exactly the same, copy and paste into another database. It doesn't work that way. You have to then take it and make it work in that database. And so the fun that you might have had making that first search kind of diminishes every time you have to figure out how this is going to work in another database. So I'll start back there and then.
My supervisor introduced me to something called Covidence.
Yes,
She
Covidence.
hasn't used it before, but she said that it's like a program that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And we have access to it, I guess. So could you maybe talk about that and maybe if you've used it before?
Yeah, Covidence or Covidence, I think there's people pronounce it differently, is a tool, and we will talk more about tools as we go on. It is a subscription-based tool, which some institutions have subscribed to. UMB currently doesn't have a subscription to Covidence, so we will talk about some of the other free software and tools out there. Covidence is mostly a screening tool. So once you've done your literature search, you have your results, you export them from a database, you put them in Zotero, and you dedupe them so that you only get one set of the articles. You haven't gotten 3 articles from 3 different databases that are exactly the same. And then in Covidence, you import the titles and the abstracts for these things, and you've put your inclusion criteria in there as well so that you can more easily screen and be able to go through and look at the title and abstract of things. You've got your inclusion criteria right there. You can have multiple people doing this at the same time, which is what we're going to talk about in a second. And so it's all automated. And it's a lot easier to run reports of how many articles did get screened out, how many did you start with. Having a tool like Covidence or one of the other tools that we're going to talk about is really, really necessary to make your process a lot easier. So that's a nutshell of that. I've sort of used it. with the scoping review, the Candy Crush situation. That's because she was using this program. It was just a little bit easier to go through and do that. So the one that I'm doing myself, I think we're going to actually look at a free tool. So this will be a good chance for me to read up on what free tools are out there and make some recommendations, because I'm going to have to use one myself. So, question, yes.
So, like, as most of the master's students in the room, like, for our thesis, we have to do a pretty extensive lit review. So what is the difference between a literature review that we would see, not necessarily as part of a thesis, but that we see in literature, like when we do searches through Scopus and stuff like that, compared to a systematic review, like one versus the other, I guess?
It's a good question. So basically, for the microphone, what's the difference between a normal literature review or narrative review and a systematic review? You want me to take this, or do you want to?
If you want it, I can do it if you want, but.
Yeah, you start. I need a water break.
Okay, so I would say that there's sort of two main differences. And the first one is that when you're writing a literature review, you're building your way towards something, right? So you're saying, this is where it started, this is the study that's been done on it, this is where we're going, this is my hypothesis. So you're building your way from an origin to an endpoint to explain where you're going from there. Systematic reviews are saying, this is what's there, and this is the answer to what's there. So it's a very, very narrow as opposed to a sort of progressive narrative process. So you're looking for, like in a literature review, you're looking for pieces that build. Systematic review is looking for all the same pieces and shoving them into one thing. The other thing, of course, is that systematic reviews are systematic. They follow a very rigid structure. It's rigid, it's inflexible. And it is that way for a reason. But it is a process that you go through. There is no expectation in a literature review that you cover every single piece of research on a topic, because that's not feasible. Specifically, particularly because literature reviews tend to be fairly short. And they are narrative in nature, at least in terms of how they're written. Whereas in a systematic review, it is expected that you found everything, and you've summarized it very, very quickly, very, very briefly, over a long period of time into a fairly swallowable chunk. I would say is probably the nutshell there.
Yeah, so you're searching for a narrative literature review is going to be less extensive, because you don't have to be as comprehensive in finding absolutely everything. It is quicker to do something like that, and it can also be, if you are trying to get familiar with a topic, reading a narrative review is fantastic, because then you've gotten that information of here is what the topic is about. Less so about here's all the research on this topic, what does it say about that? So it's a little less analytical in that respect too. I don't know if that helped, but.
Because I know a lot of people will actually publish their lit reviews from their thesis.
Yep.
But then at the end, like obviously with a systematic review, you're going in there, like with your example of you're collecting everything and you're answering like what is it that we have here. But then how would you sum up a lit review if it's just, we looked at some things and this is what we found, so I guess it wouldn't be as valid, I guess, in comparison?
Yeah, I think a literature review, it's not that it's less valid, it's trying to do a different thing.
I think you're trying to compare apples to oranges. The
Yeah.
literature review, you're really from a prof perspective, and your supervisor may disagree with me, and that's fine. But when I look at what my graduate students are doing in their lit review for their thesis, I want to be convinced. I want them to convince me that they have explored as many components of the topic as possible, so that they really understand what is the nature of research, or what is the nature of this piece of knowledge. So let's say you were doing something on the IM injection. So you would look at, okay, intramuscular injection, where did it begin? How is it operationalized? Are there studies that look at needle decisions around needle length, gauge of needles, size of the person, the material that's being injected? So you sort of explore all of those components around the topic. So it's much broader than a systematic review, which would be asking one tiny, very specific, rigid question. Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
if it's okay,
Yeah.
I'll add to that. I could never write a literature review. Sorry, it would be very difficult for me to write a literature review about intramuscular injections because I don't have any context there, and I would have to do a lot of reading to get that context. I could reasonably write a systematic review on the impact of needle length in intramuscular injections for obese people because it's 5 articles. I could sum that up and produce a systematic review on that topic. I probably shouldn't, since that's not my area of research, but I do have that capacity to say, here's everything on that topic, here's what it says, go. So it's also just a very different approach. Literature reviews are about context, they're about background, they're about the world. Systematic reviews are about this tiny little piece of a question.
And identifying the gaps in the literature.
And identifying the gaps in literature, which then lead to systematic reviews, right? So you write this literature review, you find out that there's nothing on this topic, and that's where the systematic review comes in, is to fill in that gap.
Yeah.
Rad.
Yeah. So yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing a narrative review. It's just not a systematic review. Were there other hands up before I move on? Yes.
When you say narrative review, are you?
Not in a qualitative sense.
I meant like when the introduction of say a research paper,
Mhm.
would that be considered like a narrative review because you're creating some sort of narrative for the study?
Yeah, a lot of introductions do have that narrative aspect. An introduction to a systematic review could be a bit of a narrative review, sort of. No?
I'm gonna
Am I
step
gonna be
in
confusing?
and say that the word narrative is used in many different ways across different kinds of research. So there's actually a type of qualitative research that's narrative based, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in terms of the progression of the language, it moves from one place to another place in a progression that I use the word narrative to describe. But in terms of qualitative research, that would not be narrative. So the answer to that question is more nuanced.
I guess I was kind of asking whether like a narrative review is its own standalone review, or whether it's just like a part of a larger study, like an empirical study, for example.
There's like 4 answers to that question.
Yeah, like the introduction to
a
something.
literature review can be standalone. I would say they often aren't, and many journals won't accept them, but they can be a standalone thing. A narrative paper is a type of study, or a study of narrative pieces is I think it's type of qualitative research that I'm not familiar with. And the third piece is qualitative reviews can include narrative pieces, because narrative is qualitative. So I'm not sure which piece you're looking at, but
I was just saying like the idea of narrative review, right? I was wondering whether could be like a standalone publication, like a narrative review of blah, or
Yep.
or whether
or do you mean a literature review?
We're using narrative and literature
Okay.
pretty interchangeably because, as I said, with systematic reviews, there's not standard terminology.
Okay.
So when I was prepping for this, I did see some things that talk about like what's the difference between a systematic review and a narrative review. But when they're talking about a narrative review, they're also just talking about a literature review or a plain old review. So it's language is weird and really annoying. But I would, not to confuse the point, but your introduction for your systematic review is going to have to look at generally the
Context.
literature to provide that context, but it's not going to be its own standalone thing. But when we get into the pieces of looking to see if there are other reviews written on your topic, you may come across just plain old reviews, which are those literature narrative reviews that could give you the background information, but wouldn't be useful for knowing like, oh, well, this isn't a systematic review, so no one's done a systematic review on this topic. Yay! So, but yeah, this is the fun thing about there not being any real standards, that different organizations have different types of reviews that they do. They call them something slightly different so that when we talk about it, sometimes we feel like we're just being a bit jargony. And so I appreciate having to clarify some of this stuff. All right, So we've talked a bit about teams and knowing that you shouldn't do this alone, but it's also, there are organizations and government bodies out there who are doing this as well. And that you could do you could do a review for them. And so there are standards and manuals and established processes that you can follow, and templates and things. So it's also, you don't have to do it by yourself, and you don't have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. So when you first get started, and next week we'll talk about the question that you want to ask, you're going to be looking, are there existing reviews on this topic? But you'll also have to start thinking about a team. We've mentioned this before. You should at least have somebody other than yourself, especially when you're doing the screening process, as Rochelle described, because if you disagree, you need to either come to a consensus yourselves or have a third person to make that decision. It's also useful having somebody who is an expert in the particular systematic review methodology that you're hoping to do, an expertise in information retrieval, like having a librarian, and a statistician, as we talked about. And some of these can be the same people, but trying to do it all yourself is overwhelming, and when you do get to certain stages, you really can't. If you were to screen everything yourself, you would be definitely introducing that bias to your systematic review. And we want to avoid that. So part of the prep, once you have your question in mind, will be finding out if that's already been done or not. Is there already a systematic review or scoping review or whatever kind of review on that topic? And if there is, what's the quality? Does it need to be updated? Is it really old? Should it be updated? And to do this, you need to know actually where to look for systematic reviews. And a lot of them, like I say, could be from organizations and governments. The main ones are the Cochrane Collaboration, which is based out of the UK, but people worldwide are working on systematic reviews for them in healthcare. The Joanna Briggs Institute, which I mentioned, is based out of Australia, but again, people worldwide are working on these types of reviews in healthcare, lots of nursing topics and qualitative topics. In St. John, we do have a JBI Center of Excellence, I think it is now, unofficially. So there is a group of researchers in St. John who are affiliated with the JBI group, and we publish in their publication and have to adhere to their standards and guidelines. And there's also the Campbell Collaboration, which they have their headquarters in Norway and are more focused on the social sciences. So not just health are doing systematic reviews. And there's others like the Epicenter in London and others in software engineering, environmental science, and ecology. So it is getting quite broad. And also government organizations like the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, or NICE in the UK, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology, CADTH, here in Canada. They actually do a lot of rapid reviews for organizations and people. In the US, you've got the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Germany's got one, France has one, so lots of different people are doing systematic reviews all over the world. And so where can you find them? Because clearly they have to publish somewhere. They're not just all sitting on their websites. And can you just find the finished products, or can you also find the protocols? And this is what we're going to be talking about a bit later as well, reinforcing that you should do a protocol and what that is. So if you are looking for systematic reviews and protocols, going to protocol registries and the people who produce systematic reviews are a good place to start. So one place that is a protocol registry that is freely accessible, to search at least, is something called Prospero. The Cochrane Library is good for protocols and finished systematic reviews. PubMed actually has Cochrane systematic reviews, but doesn't have the protocols. And those come first. And quite often, once somebody has published a protocol, it may then take them a while to actually get their systematic review finished and published in the literature. So you finding protocols is really important, because if your topic is currently a protocol that's been published, then you have to see how old is that? Is it exactly the same topic? Do I want to do my research in this area if somebody's already working on it? Or maybe you can reach out and partner with them. Other places to look, the JBI Database of Systematic Reviews and Implementation Reports, which is accessible through PubMed and CINAHL. Databases are really great places to look, and we can go into a bit later how to actually search the databases on these topics to try and find systematic reviews and protocols. And particularly like PubMed, Embase, Scopus. Then there's a couple of free places like TRIP and the Systematic Review Database Repository. So there are ways to search these databases, either using the database filters for systematic reviews or doing really creative keyword searching. And that's probably what I would recommend over the filters. So yeah. We can also post some of these resources on D2L, because I know I've just listed off a bunch of places you can look for stuff without, showing you what those resources actually are.
Well, and this video is recorded, so hopefully the video will be available this week.
Yeah.
All?
But I think having a list so they don't have to sift
Yeah.
through like an hour worth of video to find all of the things I've just listed. We can give you actual links to them. But yes, it's important to try and see if somebody has already done a systematic review or a scoping review on the topic and the question that you're going to answer. Because if they have, and it's exactly the same, and the quality's really good, then you probably don't want to waste your time, and you want to maybe focus on something else. All right, so when I said you don't have to go it alone while doing its systematic reviews, I did mention standards and manuals and checklists that already exist to help you. So if you do want to do a systematic review but not partner with any of these organizations, because I think it's really hard to do like a Cochrane review, you have to, there's a whole process. But you could look at the Cochrane handbook and see how they do systematic reviews and try and adhere to some of their guidelines. Same with Prisma, which Rochelle talked about and we will talk more about later. There are certain standards for how to do that. The Joanna Briggs Institute has a whole manual available online that you could look at different pieces. Pretty much everybody has got something if they're doing systematic reviews. There's also articles that you could read on guiding you with the methodology, which we can make available as well. And we do have some books that you can borrow through UMB and through interlibrary loan for how to do these sorts of things as well. And Rochelle did mention that we'll talk a bit about, journal submission guidelines and things, because it is really important that if you do want to publish these somewheres, before you get started, you should look at the places that you might want to consider publishing in, see if they do have standards or guidelines for how they want you to do systematic reviews, because it's probably going to be easier to get published if you follow what they want and start that earlier rather than later. So I do have a couple of links to those, because there's a couple of, there's like a systematic review journal that exists that might be a good place to publish. Oh, okay. So that was a lot of information that we've just thrown at you. Does anybody have questions right off the bat? I know we've been asking questions throughout, which is great. And we will get to some of the hands-on stuff. Rochelle's just gone to see if we can get an extra hand for the next section. But I think we're ready to take a break.
Yeah.
Yes.